I love those dear hearts and gentle people.
It's time to talk about religious and not-for-profit tax exemptions, and specifically how the Australian government goes about upholding them. I'm a happy atheist, and my first video was about science and its implications for volunteer work. I think you saw this subject coming. An integral starting point to this discussion is the issue of separation of church and state. I'm an ardent supporter of the separation of church and state for quite pragmatic reasons. I'm an atheist, but I'm sure many of you watching this video would probably be Christian, Jewish, or of some other religious persuasion. That reference of demographics alone is clear evidence for why religion should be kept out of matters of government. Very few people think or believe exactly the same way. According to religiousTolerance.org, there are 19 world religions, which are divided into 270 large religious groups and uncountable smaller ones. 34,000 Christian organizations have been identified in the world, Religious Tolerance estimates. We've seen this abundantly throughout history. If a ruling body is geared toward a particular religion in its policies, it will inevitably disadvantage or discriminate against citizens who do not follow that religion, or even people of a different variant of that religion. Therefore, it is better for governments to steer clear of religion altogether and not allow it to influence policy, thereby treating its citizens, regardless of faith, with complete fairness and impartiality. Notions of keeping church and state separate originate as far back as Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation, in his two kingdoms doctrine of law and gospel operating separately while still under God, and Enlightenment philosopher John Locke's Social Contract, in which Locke asserts that the government has no authority over our own reason or conscience. But in 1789, the separation of church and state received its most lasting and authoritative expression in the First Amendment of the U.S. Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the amendment declares. Sharing the paragraph with other American tenets such as freedom of speech, press, and the right to assemble, this fundamental ideal of the U.S. Constitution essentially prohibits the government from promoting any religion or preventing its observance by the public. The First Amendment has not always been successfully enforced, unfortunately. Religious requirements for public office on a federal level in America were abolished from the moment the Constitution was ratified in 1788, but religious requirements for office on a state level were not fully abolished by the Supreme Court until 1961. Even so, 8 U.S. states, including Texas, because of course, still have state constitutions barring atheists from office. Religious lobby groups still have significant sway over politics. Many U.S. politicians, more so the Republican right, are informed by religion in their policymaking, which we've also seen in Australian politics too, and hardline religious groups still have their fingers in science textbooks in certain southern states. Coming full circle, there are also the enormous tax exemptions that American religious institutions have received since the 1880s. This is an admittedly extreme example, but I'm glad that in December 2014, the Kentucky Tourism, Arts, and Heritage Cabinet revoked the $18 million in tax incentives that they initially granted to Ark Encounter, a $135 million creationist theme park under construction in the state. The park and its founder, Ken Ham, were refusing to hire non-Christians, were screening out people with more liberal worldviews, and subjected its employees to tests of their devotion. Good on Kentucky for standing against this discriminatory lunacy. Australia also, sometimes shakily, observes the separation of church and state, with our constitutional entry modelled closely on America's. Article 5, Section 116 maintains that the Commonwealth shall not make any law for establishing any religion, or for imposing any religious observance, or for prohibiting the free exercise of any religion, and no religious test shall be required as a qualification for any office or public trust under the Commonwealth. Our recent prime ministers have been, in succession, 2 Anglicans, Howard and Rudd, an atheist, Gillard, and a Catholic, Abbott, which shows you that the final statement is working. Separation of church and state is evidently important to Australians. Writing for The Drum, Chris Fotonopoulos cites a 2010 Harold Nielsen poll which found that 84% of people surveyed agreed with the statement religion and politics should be separate. Australia is a country of increasing multiculturalism, diversity, and also secularism. Figures provided by ID and Index Mundi's Australia Demographics Profile 2014, both drawn from the Australian 2011 census, found that Christianity is still the primary religion of Australia, with Christians comprising 61.1% of the population. However, of that Christian demographic, the Oz population contains about a quarter Catholic, 17% Anglican, 5% Uniting, 2.8% Presbyterian, and a smattering of other denominations such as Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. Non-Christian religions such as Judaism, Sikhism, Buddhism, and Islam collectively total 7.2% of Australians, but here's the kicker: 22.3% of Australians are non-religious. With Australia's sheer diversity of religious types, including irreligion, it is imperative that the separation of church and state be upheld, so that none of these groups are governed unfairly on the basis of belief. So, what do the huge tax exemptions received by religious institutions say about this separation? Church organizations in Australia do not have to pay income tax, fringe benefits tax, GST, or capital gains tax for their commercial ventures. Religious charities and philanthropic programs are registered for tax exemption by the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission and the Australian Taxation Office. Barney Zwartz, writing for The Age, reported in 2006 that tax exemptions for Australian churches are costing federal, state, and local governments more than $500 million a year. Just in Melbourne, the Melbourne City Council found that church exemptions from rates cost it $10 million a year, pushing up charges for other ratepayers by 10%. Fotonopoulos claims that the Australian government provides financial assistance to the tune of $31 billion annually to religious institutions. That's even more staggering when you consider that in the US, the government subsidies of religious institutions are worth as much as $71 billion per year. I believe that religious organizations should not receive tax exemption, with one important exception. Let me make a clear distinction between religious organizations themselves and their charitable extensions. In defense of religious tax exemptions, Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference Secretary Brian Lucas said that the Church used money saved on tax for welfare and assures us that the Church was strictly accountable to the government to the last dollar for money it received for health, education, and welfare. Not-for-profit religious charities such as the Salvation Army, World Vision Australia, and the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence provide vital service to the community in their efforts to alleviate poverty, help the homeless, and feed the hungry. For their genuinely beneficial contributions to society, I have no problem with them continuing to receive the same tax exemptions that any non-religious charity receives. But the churches themselves should not receive tax exemptions, and especially not their commercial enterprises. Sanitarium is owned by the Seventh-day Adventists. There are religious publishing companies, Broughton Publishing, and finance companies, ASS Financial, and Hillsong Group is a thriving publishing house and media production company. The Roman Catholic Church, Croucher continues, runs an insurance company, a mortgage broking business, car parks, a winery, and controls more than $4 billion through the various super funds that it managed. Some people say that the Pancake Parlor is owned by the Church of Scientology, but that's just a rumor. Zwartz notes how critics of religious exemptions claim taxpayers are subsidizing church and charity-run commercial operations, which sometimes use tax advantages to undercut commercial rivals. More angrily, Jane Shaw, editor of Crikey, stressed that these are for-profit activities. They are not charitable or even evangelical. They are in the business of being in business. But even setting aside the unjust tax cuts that church-owned companies enjoy and the immense wealth of many parent churches, my reason for opposing religious tax exemptions is, yet again, simple pragmatism. An article on the Australian Taxpayers Alliance website sought to dispel assumptions of unfair tax exemption by pointing out that many other non-profit organizations receive exemptions. If you exist to promote encouragement of art, literature, music, if you're a trade union or a university, if you want to promote fishing, agriculture, tourism, or vine culture, or even if you want to promote animal racing or sports, or if you fall into one of many, many other categories, you are exempt from income tax. There is nothing special about promoting religion. But my immediate response is, of course there's something special about promoting religion. I don't believe in any religion, but that's simultaneously not the point and the whole point. Few people believe or worship exactly the same way as the next person, so it is unfair to expect Australian citizens to pay for institutions that they don't support or believe in, whether it's an atheist paying for a church, or a Christian paying for a different denomination's church, or a Muslim paying for a synagogue. Besides, tax breaks for churches, religious schools, and missionary institutions are ostensibly government promotion of religion, and this preferential treatment for religion goes against the separation of church and state. As such, I believe an important revision of terms is needed in the approval of not-for-profit religious charities for tax exemption. The Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission is the independent national regulator of charities and seeks to support and maintain a robust, vibrant, and innovative not-for-profit sector. For religious charities to be recognized as such by the ACNC, they need to confirm their charitable purpose as a means of advancing religion. The Australian Taxation Office defines a registered religious institution as one that is both a registered charity and registered with the ACNC for the charity subtype of an entity with the purpose that is the advancement of religion. That just seems incredibly wrong-headed to me. John L. Perkins and Frank Gomez on perkins.theatheist.net argue that it is not rational or justifiable that the advancement of religion should be considered of itself a public benefit. I agree, as advancing religion on its own is not a charitable act. It's what you do with religion that's hopefully charitable, and only benefits those already under or soon to adopt said religion. In a 2008 document, the Australia-New Zealand Secular Association proposes that the advancement of religion as a ground for charitable and hence tax-exempt status should be abolished. My thoughts exactly. Tax exemptions for charities, religious or secular, should continue, but the ACNC and ATO should no longer approve religious not-for-profits for exemption on the basis of advancing religion. Many religious not-for-profits deliver undeniable good to their communities, and religious not-for-profits should be approved if they are delivering tangible, altruistic benefit to their community. That real social support should be the base standard for issuing tax exemption in any context, and already is for non-religious charities. I contend that the ATO's granting of tax exemptions to religious charities for the reason of advancing religion is tantamount to the government endorsing religion, which it must not do in a secular society. I wholeheartedly support the separation of church and state as an element of a fair, equal society. Even religious people should be secularists, and a lot are, as they hopefully don't want other faiths infringing upon their own, or their faith pushed upon others. The separation of church and state dictates that governments should neither promote nor suppress religion. As such, maintaining tax exemptions for churches, especially for their commercial offshoots, contradicts the separation of church and state, as this constitutes very sizable support for religion when government should make no direct contribution to faith. As such, I think that religious tax exemptions should be phased out, with the exception of religious charities, but the approval process must be revised and the criterion of advancing religion scrapped, as the government of an increasingly diverse and secular Australia should not endorse religion and have its citizens pay for what they may not support. Keep the legitimate religious charities going, but if you want a fairer Australia for every taxpayer of any faith or lack of faith, abolish religious tax exemptions.